My son handed me a gold pen and a leather folder the day before my retirement party and told me it was time to let go. He called it a formality, a final step to ensure my well-deserved rest, but when I looked at the fine print, I realized he wasn't just taking over the company, he was erasing my entire life. My name was gone, my equity was gone. Even the house I'd built for my late wife was being stripped away by my own flesh and blood. He thought he was burying a tired old man who had outlived his usefulness. He forgot that you never try to pull the foundation out from under the architect who poured the concrete. I stood in the corner office of the 20th floor, looking out over the city of Des Moines through floor-to-ceiling glass that I had personally inspected for stress fractures 3 years ago. From up here, the world looked organized, clean, and profitable. But I didn't grow up on the 20th floor. I grew up in the mud, my hands, currently resting on a mahogany desk that cost more than my first 3 trucks combined, were a map of 25 years of labor, scars from rebar, calluses from the sledgehammer, and the permanent gray ghost of concrete dust embedded in my knuckles. 25 years of Dalton construction. We weren't just a company. We were the backbone of this county. We built the schools, the hospitals, and the very office tower I was standing in. The door clicked open. I didn't need to turn around to know it was my son, Julian. He smelled of expensive cologne and air-conditioned offices, a sharp contrast to the smell of diesel and sweat that had defined my life. "Evening, Dad," Julian said, his voice smooth, practiced, and utterly devoid of the grit it takes to actually build something. He walked to the sideboard, poured 2 fingers of a 30-year-old Macallan, and set that thick leather folder on my desk. He slid the gold pen toward me, the one I'd given him when he finished his MBA at Chicago. "The board is all set for tomorrow's announcement," Julian said, leaning against the window frame. "We just need to clear up the final transition documents. It's just a formality, really. Sign the last few pages and you're free. No more 5 a.m. site visits, no more lawsuits, just the golf course and the beach house." I looked at my son. He was 32, sharp-jawed, wearing a suit that cost $4,000. I remembered him at 6, sitting in the cab of my excavator, wearing a plastic hard hat that kept slipping over his eyes. I had built all of this, the cranes, the contracts, the reputation, so he would never have to feel the bite of the winter wind on a high-rise girding. I thought I was giving him a future. I didn't realize I was giving him the tools to bury me. "A formality," I repeated, my voice sounding like gravel hitting a tin roof. "Exactly," Julian said, checking his watch. "A Rolex I'd bought him for his first $1 million contract. I've got a dinner at 8 with the investors from the Vanguard Group. They're excited about the new direction, the digital-first construction model." I picked up the folder. "I've spent 25 years reading blueprints and ironclad legal contracts. I know that the most dangerous things are never in the headlines. They are hidden in the margins." I flipped past the ceremonial pages, past the lifetime achievement fluff, and went straight to the addendum. My heart didn't race. It turned into a cold stone. The document wasn't a transition of power. It was a total and absolute relinquishment of all equity, intellectual property, and operating control. It included a non-compete clause that banned me from the industry for 10 years, but the kicker, the jagged piece of glass in the middle of the sandwich, was the clawback clause. It stated that due to undisclosed liabilities from my previous projects, my entire retirement pension and the deeds to the beach house and my primary residence were being recollateralized to the company. If I signed this, I wouldn't just be retired. I would be evicted. My name would be erased from the company I founded, and I would be left with exactly what I started with in 1999, nothing. Before I reveal the look on my son's face when I close that folder, I want to offer a gentle reminder. This story is based on the hard-earned lessons of a lifetime. Some elements have been altered for narrative and educational purposes. Any similarities to real people or locations are coincidental, but the truth behind the message is meant to help you stay vigilant. In business and in family, the person holding the pen is often more dangerous than the person holding the hammer. "Julian," I said, my thumb tracing the edge of the paper. "This says I'm transferring my personal property to the corporation." Julian didn't flinch. He didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. He took a slow sip of his whiskey. "The Vanguard investors did a deep dive into the books, Dad. They found some irregularities in the Miller Heights project from 5 years ago. Environmental stuff. Potential lawsuits. To keep the company's valuation high enough for the merger, we had to show that the outgoing leadership, that's you, is taking personal responsibility for those risks. It's just a paper shield, Dad. Once the merger closes and I'm CEO, I'll take care of you. You know that." "I know the Miller Heights project was clean, Julian," I said. "I was on that site every day. I checked every soil sample myself." "The data says otherwise," Julian snapped, his loyal son mask slipping for a heartbeat. "That's your problem, Dad. You think a company is made of dirt and rebar. It's not. It's made of numbers, risk assessment, and growth. You're a builder. I'm a titan. And a titan doesn't let a builder sink a $300 million deal because he wants to keep a beach house in Florida." I looked at the scars on my hands. I thought about 1999. I had mortgaged our small house 3 times to keep the payroll going when the recession hit. Julian's mother, God rest her soul, had worked double shifts as a nurse just so we could buy our first crane. We didn't have data. We had sweat. We had a word that was worth more than a signed contract. "So that's it?" I asked quietly. 25 years? And you're firing me from my own life?" Julian set his glass down with a sharp clack on the desk. "I'm evolving the species, Dad. You should be proud. You built the ladder, but I'm the one climbing into the clouds. Sign the papers. Don't make tomorrow's party awkward. I'd hate for the local press to hear that the great Elias Dalton had to be escorted out of his own building by security." I stood up. "Is still have the shoulders of a man who spent his youth moving stones." Julian instinctively took a step back. "I'm not signing anything tonight, Julian," I said. "Dad, don't be stubborn. The board meets at 8 a.m. If your signature isn't on that document, I'll trigger the emergency incapacity clause. I've already got 2 psychologists on retainer who are ready to testify that your sight fixation and memory lapses are signs of early-onset dementia. I'll take control anyway. This way, at least you keep your dignity." I felt a roar of fury in my gut, but I didn't let it reach my face. A builder knows that when you're facing a collapsing wall, you don't scream at it. You find the center of gravity. "Dementia," I whispered. "Is that what we're calling it now?" "It's just business, Dad," Julian said, regaining his composure. "I'll see you at the gala tomorrow. Wear the blue suit. It makes you look reliable." He turned and walked out, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind him. I sat back down in the silence of the office. The city lights were flickering on, thousands of tiny eyes watching the empire I had built. I looked at the gold pen he'd left on the desk. Julian thought he was the architect of this play. He thought he had calculated every variable. But he made one fatal mistake, the same mistake every data-driven executive makes. He assumed that because I was old, I had forgotten how the machine works. He thought I was a builder who only knew how to follow a blueprint. He forgot that I'm the one who wrote the codes for this city. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in 5 years. "Silas?" I said when the voice answered. "It's Elias. Is your crew still doing the inspection at the riverfront towers?" "We just finished the foundation pour, boss," Silas said, his voice a comforting growl of tobacco and experience. "Why? Something wrong?" "I need you to meet me at the old warehouse on 4th Street, the one where we keep the legacy files. And Silas, bring the heavy-duty scanner. We're going to do a deep dive into the Miller Heights data." "You sound like you're going to war, Elias." "No, Silas," I said, looking at the fine print in the folder one last time. I'm just doing a final inspection, and I have a feeling I'm going to find some very unstable structures. I hung up and looked at the gold pen. I didn't sign the papers. Instead, I snapped the pen in half and let the ink bleed across the mahogany desk. Julian wanted a digital-first company. He wanted a world where dirt didn't matter. Well, I was about to show him that even the most sophisticated cloud-based empire can't stand if you pull the pins out of the concrete. The demolition was scheduled for tomorrow morning, and I wasn't going to be the one buried in the rubble. I grabbed my old work jacket, the one with the faded Dalton construction patch on the shoulder, and walked out. I didn't take the elevator. I took the stairs. 20 floors of concrete and steel. 20 floors of my life. As I hit the lobby, the security guard, an old-timer named Mike, who had been with me since the beginning, nodded. "Leaving late tonight, Mr. Dalton?" "Just checking the foundation, Mike," I said. Just checking the foundation. I walked out into the cold night air, the smell of rain and asphalt filling my lungs. Julian thought he was erasing my name. He had no idea that I was just getting ready to rewrite it in permanent ink. The old warehouse on 4th Street didn't smell like success. It smelled of motor oil, damp cardboard, and the metallic tang of heavy machinery, the scent of the first 10 years of my life. While Julian was sleeping in a climate-controlled penthouse, surrounded by silk sheets and data-driven dreams, I was standing under the flickering hum of a shop light, looking at the bones of the empire he was so eager to steal. Silas was already there, his old Ford F250 idling in the bay. He was leaning against the fender, a thermos of black coffee in one hand and a stack of blueprints in the other. Silas had been my site foreman for 22 years. He was a man who measured his life in cubic yards of concrete and the straightness of a plumb line. He didn't care about mergers, and he certainly didn't care about digital-first construction. "You look like you've been through a structural collapse, Elias," Silas said, handing me a chipped porcelain mug. "The collapse hasn't happened yet, Silas," I rasped, taking a sip of the bitter, scorching liquid. "But the cracks are wide enough to see through. I need the Miller Heights files, the real ones, the physical site logs from 5 years ago." Silas didn't ask why. He just walked to the back of the warehouse, to the heavy steel filing cabinets that Julian had ordered sent to the dump 3 months ago. I had intercepted that truck and redirected it here. Julian thought that if a record wasn't on a server, it didn't exist. He forgot that the most important truths are written in ink and stained with coffee. We spent the next 4 hours digging. The warehouse was freezing, the kind of cold that settles into your joints and reminds you of every winter poor you ever managed. But as we turned the pages, the cold was replaced by a slow, simmering heat in my chest. Julian's data about Miller Heights was a fabrication. He hadn't found environmental irregularities. He had created them on paper. I saw the trail of breadcrumbs, the consulting fees paid to a shell company called Apex Environmental Solutions. I recognized the address of that shell company. It was a P.O. box in Delaware, registered to Julian's college roommate. Julian had siphoned $2 million out of the Miller Heights budget, disguised as mitigation costs, and then buried the theft under a mountain of fake reports. He wasn't trying to protect the company from my liabilities. He was using those fake liabilities to blackmail me into signing over my life's work, so I could never audit the books and find out he'd been robbing me blind for 5 years. "He's not just a thief, Silas," I said, pointing to a ledger entry. "He's a saboteur. Look at the supplier invoices for the new riverfront project." Silas leaned in, his brow furrowed. "That's the high-density rebar we ordered from Sheffield Steel. What about it?" "Check the delivery logs," I said. "The digital system says we received grade 60 steel, but the physical weight bridge tickets from the gate show grade 40. That's a 30% difference in structural capacity, Silas. That building is 20 stories high. If they keep stacking floors on that foundation, the lower columns are going to buckle before the glass is even installed." Silas's face went the color of wet cement. He's cutting corners on the structural integrity? For what? To pad the quarterly reports for the Vanguard investors? To show a higher profit margin so he gets a bigger seat at the merger table, I said. He's betting the building stays up until the check clears. He's not just erasing my name, Silas. He's risking lives to do it. Before I show you the most painful discovery of that night, the document that proved my son had sold the very roof over my head, I want to ask you a question. Have you ever realized that the person you were building a future for was actually the one pulling the pins out of your present? Tell me your story in the comments. I read every one of them, and it reminds me that even in the mud, we aren't alone. I reached the bottom of the drawer and found a manila envelope marked Personal, Confidential. Inside was a copy of a mortgage deed. I felt the air leave my lungs. 2 months ago, while I was recovering from a bout of pneumonia, Julian had brought a stack of papers to my bedside. He told me they were insurance renewals and site authorizations. I had trusted him. I had signed them without looking at the fine print because I was tired, and he was my son. He hadn't renewed my insurance. He had taken out a $5 million private loan against my primary residence and the beach house I'd bought for his mother. The loan was in the company's name, but the collateral was my life. And the money from that loan? It hadn't gone into the Dalton construction accounts. It had been moved into a private equity fund in the Cayman Islands. My son hadn't just fired me. He had bankrupted. If I didn't sign the papers tomorrow, he would trigger the incapacity clause, take the company, and let the private loan default. I would lose the house my wife died in. I would lose the legacy I had built for my grandkids. I would be a 60-year-old man on the street with a dementia diagnosis hanging around my neck like a millstone. I sat on a wooden crate, the silence of the warehouse pressing down on me. I looked at the gray dust on my knuckle. Julian thought I was a relic. He thought I was a builder who only knew how to follow a blueprint. He assumed that because I didn't understand the digital-first world, I couldn't see the theft happening in the code. But he forgot one fundamental rule of construction. The blueprint is just a suggestion. The reality is in the material. "What's the move, Elias?" Silas asked, his voice low and dangerous. "The board meeting is in 4 hours. The gala is at noon. We can call the police, but with the forged signatures and the shell companies, it'll take years to sort out. By then, he'll be in Cabo, and the company will be a memory." "No police," I said, standing up. My joints creaked, but my spine was straight. A builder doesn't call the police when a wall is crooked. He picks up a sledgehammer and he resets the line. I walked to the heavy-duty scanner on the workbench. "Silas, I need you to go to the riverfront site, now. Take the core sample drill. I want physical proof of that grade 40 steel in the footings. I want photos of the batch numbers on the concrete pours. And then I want you to call the city building inspector, the one Julian didn't bribe. Tell him there's a public safety emergency at the Dalton site." "That'll kill the company, Elias," Silas warned. "The lawsuits alone—" "The company is already dead, Silas," I said, looking at the broken gold pen in my mind. "My son killed it when he decided that numbers mattered more than people. I'm not trying to save Dalton construction. I'm trying to save the city from a Dalton-built disaster." I spent the next 3 hours at that scanner. I didn't just copy the files. I cross-referenced the physical logs with the digital shadows. I built a demolition report that was more thorough than any skyscraper I'd ever designed. I found the signatures. I found the emails. I found the moment Julian decided that his father's life was just a line item to be liquidated. At 7 a.m., the sun began to bleed through the warehouse windows, a pale, cold light that offered no warmth. I went to the washroom, splashed cold water on my face, and looked in the mirror. I didn't see a senile old man. I didn't see a retired executive. I saw a man who had spent 25 years pouring foundations. I saw a man who knew exactly where the load-bearing beams were. And I saw a man who was ready to pull the pins. I put on my blue suit. The one Julian said made me look reliable. I straightened my tie. I looked at the thick leather folder I'd brought from the office. It was still empty, but the digital drive in my pocket was full. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Julian. "Boardroom. 8 a.m. sharp, Dad. Don't be late. We have a lot of data to go over." I didn't respond. I walked out of the warehouse and got into my truck, the same one I'd bought when we hit our first $10 million year. It rattled, it smelled of diesel, and the heater didn't work. But it was solid. It was real. As I drove toward the glass tower downtown, I watched the city wake up. People were heading to the schools I'd built, the hospitals I'd reinforced. They trusted the ground they stood on because my name was on the foundation. Julian thought he was the new king of the clouds. He had no idea that I was the one who controlled the gravity. I pulled into the executive parking garage at 7:55 a.m. The security guard, Mike, tipped his cap. "Ready for the big day, Mr. Dalton." "The biggest, Mike," I said, grabbing my folder. "The biggest." I walked into the lobby. The marble floors were polished to a mirror shine. The elevators were silent and fast. I hit the button for the 20th floor. The doors opened, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive coffee and unearned confidence. The board members were already there, sitting around the mahogany table like vultures waiting for the feast. Julian was at the head of the table, looking at his Rolex. He looked up and smiled, that shark-like MBA smile. "Morning, Dad. Glad you could make it. Have you had time to process those formality documents?" I took my seat at the far end of the table. I didn't open the folder. I just looked at my son. "I processed them, Julian," I said, my voice echoing in the silent room. "And I have to say, your attention to detail is impressive, but you missed one thing." Julian's smile faltered just an inch. "And what's that?" "You forgot that I'm the one who laid the first brick," I said, pulling the digital drive from my pocket and sliding it onto the table. "And I never pour a foundation without a backup plan." The demolition was live, and I was the only one in the room with a hard hat. The boardroom was silent, the kind of silence you only find in a room where the air is filtered, the light is artificial, and the people are waiting to sign a death warrant. I sat at the far end of the table, the digital drive I'd pulled from the warehouse heavy in my pocket, like a live wire against my thigh. Julian sat at the head of the table, radiating the kind of confidence that comes from a man who has never had to look at a foundation he didn't buy with someone else's money. Beside him sat two representatives from the Vanguard Group, men in steel-gray suits with eyes that looked like they were made of spreadsheets. They didn't see me as a builder. They saw me as a depreciating asset. "Elias," one of the investors, a man named Sterling, said with a tight professional smile, "Julian has walked us through the Miller Heights situation. We appreciate your willingness to assume personal responsibility for those liabilities. It's a very honorable move. It clears the path for the merger to proceed smoothly." I looked at the thick leather folder sitting on the mahogany. I let my hand shake just a fraction when I reached for the water glass. I let a bit of a dazed, weary expression settle over my face. I needed to be the broken man they expected. I needed them to believe I was already defeated so they wouldn't look for the sledgehammer behind my back. "Miller Heights," I whispered, my voice sounding thin and ragged. "I spent 6 months on that site. Every morning at 5 a.m. The soil was clean. I have the logs." Julian let out a performative, heavy sigh, looking at the board members with a "see what I mean" expression. "We've been through this, Dad. The logs were incomplete. Digital records show a different story. You're tired. You're misremembering. That's why we're doing this, for your peace of mind." I looked at my son. Behind that expensive suit and that Wharton smile, I saw a stranger. I saw a man who was willing to gaslight his own father into a dementia diagnosis just to cover up a $2 million theft. "Maybe you're right, Julian," I said, letting my head sag. "Everything is so digital now. I don't know how to read the clouds anymore. But before I hand over the keys, I need to do one last walk through. I need to see the riverfront project. It's my last build. I want to see the foundation before the glass goes up." Julian checked his Rolex, his jaw tightening. "Dad, the gala is in 4 hours. We have a schedule. The press will be there. The mayor is giving you a key to the city." "1 hour," I pleaded, making my voice sound desperate. "Just 1 hour at the site. Then I'll come back, put on the blue suit, and sign whatever you want. I just need to touch the concrete one last time." Julian looked at the Vanguard reps. Sterling shrugged. "It's a fair request, Julian. A final inspection for the founder. It looks good for the legacy narrative." "Fine," Julian snapped, leaning back. 1 hour. Silas is at the site. He can escort you, but don't touch anything, and don't talk to the crew. You're a consultant emeritus now, Elias. Act like one." I stood up, leaning heavily on the table as if I needed the support. Consultant emeritus. It has a nice ring to it. I walked out of the boardroom, feeling the eyes of the vultures on my back. I didn't take the company car. I took my old truck. As I pulled out of the garage, I felt the broken man mask fall away. My jaw set. My hands gripped the wheel, and the fire that had built Dalton Construction from a garage op into an empire roared back to life. Before I reveal what Silas and I found under the riverfront tower, the discovery that turned a construction site into a crime scene, I want to offer a gentle reminder. This story is a reflection of the hard-earned wisdom of a generation that built with stone for a generation that thinks the world is made of glass. Some elements have been altered for narrative and educational purposes. Any similarities to real people or locations are coincidental, but the truth behind the message is meant to help you stay vigilant. Always inspect the material before you trust the man. The Riverfront project was a 20-story luxury residential tower, the crown jewel of Julian's digital-first expansion. As I pulled up to the site, the groans of the cranes and the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the pile drivers felt like home. But the air was wrong. Usually a site I managed smelled of fresh pine and wet stone. This one smelled of shortcuts and fear. Silas was waiting by the foreman's trailer, his hard hat tucked under his arm. He looked at me, then at my old truck, and a small, knowing grin touched his lips. "Boardroom didn't break you then?" Silas asked, handing me a high-visibility vest. "A boardroom can't break what a sledgehammer couldn't, Silas," I said, snapping the vest on. "Where's the core drill?" "In the back of my rig. I've already flagged the southeast support columns. The batch numbers on the concrete delivery don't match the engineering specs, Elias. Not even close." We walked toward the skeletal frame of the tower. The crew was working fast. Too fast. I saw a younger foreman barking orders, pushing the men to set the forms for the next floor, even though the previous pour looked suspiciously green. "Who's that?" I asked. "A kid Julian brought in. Name's Miller. No experience, but he's great with a spreadsheet. He's been ordering the men to skip the 24-hour curing wait times to optimize the timeline." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. "Silas, if those columns haven't cured and the rebar is substandard, this building isn't a residential tower. It's a vertical graveyard." We reached the base of the southeast pillar. Silas set up the core drill, a heavy diamond-tipped machine designed to pull a cylinder of hardened concrete from the heart of the structure. The sound was deafening, a high-pitched scream of metal against stone. I stood over it, my hand on the pillar, feeling the vibrations. "Stop!" a voice roared. I turned to see the young foreman, Miller, charging toward us. He looked terrified. "What are you doing? This is a restricted area. You don't have authorization for a core sample." I didn't move. I stood in front of that pillar like I was part of the foundation itself. I looked at the kid, and for a second, he saw the man who had built this city. "I built the foundation you're standing on, son," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "I don't need authorization to check the quality of my own name. Now, step back before I show you exactly what a consultant emeritus does with a core drill." Miller faltered. He looked at Silas, who was 3 times his size and holding a heavy-duty wrench. He looked at me, and he saw the demolition. He backed away, reaching for his radio. "I'm calling Julian. Tell him I'm doing the final inspection," I said. Silas pulled the drill back. The cylinder of concrete came out. It didn't look like high-density, grade 60 material. It looked like gray chalk. It was porous, brittle, and when Silas tapped it with a hammer, a large chunk simply crumbled away. "Grade 40, Silas whispered, his face pale. "Maybe even grade 30. Julian bought the cheapest mix on the market and charged the investors for the premium stuff. He pocketed the difference. Nearly $4 million across the whole project. It's worse than that, Silas," I said, looking up at the 20 floors of weight pressing down on these brittle columns. The structural load limit for this tower was calculated for grade 60. With grade 40, the safety margin is gone. If a heavy storm hits this city, or if they load the upper floors with furniture and people, the southeast corner is going to shear off. It'll pull the whole building down like a house of cards. I looked at my watch. 10:30 a.m., 90 minutes until the gala. "Silas," I said, "we need to make a call, not to the police, to the city building inspector, the one who worked with my father, Arthur Vance. Arthur is retired, Elias. He won't have the authority. He has the reputation," I said, "and he knows the code. I need him here in 30 minutes, and Silas, get the men off the site. Tell them there's a gas leak. Tell them whatever you have to, but clear this building, now." While Silas cleared the site, I went into the foreman's trailer. I used the administrative override on the site computer, a code Julian never bothered to change because he thought I was a relic. I accessed the digital delivery logs. There it was, the smoking gun. Julian hadn't just switched the concrete. He had forged my digital signature on the structural safety certificates. He had used my name to vouch for a building he knew was a death trap. He wasn't just stealing my money and my house. He was setting me up to be the fall guy for a disaster that would kill hundreds. If the building fell, the data would show that I had signed off on the substandard materials while I was suffering from dementia. I felt a cold, sharp stone where my heart used to be. My son, my own blood. He didn't just want me out of the way. He wanted me in a prison cell. I downloaded the forgeries, the real Waitbridge tickets, and the photos of the crumbling core sample to the drive. Then I found the final piece of the puzzle, the land lease. Julian was so focused on the company's assets that he hadn't checked the property history of the glass tower downtown, the Dalton Plaza. The building was owned by the corporation, but the land it sat on was personally owned by me through a 99-year lease I'd signed with the city back in 1999. The lease had a character clause. If the tenant, Dalton Construction, was found to be in gross violation of public safety codes, the lease could be terminated immediately, and the building would revert to the landowner. Me. I stood in the dusty trailer, the smell of diesel and the sound of the wind rattling the tin roof. I looked at my knuckles. Julian thought he was the architect of my demise. He thought he was playing a high-stakes game of chess against a man who only knew how to move checkers. He had no idea that I had just changed the rules of the game. "Elias!" Silas shouted from the door. "Arthur Vance is here, and he's not alone. He brought the current chief inspector. They saw the core sample. They're issuing an immediate stop work order and a condemned status for the riverfront site." "Good," I said, grabbing my drive. "Now, let's go to the gala. I have a toast to give." "You're going to tell them?" Silas asked. "I'm going to do more than tell them, Silas," I said, straightening my hard hat one last time. "I'm going to show them exactly what happens when you build on a foundation of lies." I drove back toward the city, the glass tower gleaming in the midday sun. It looked like a monument to success, but I knew better. I knew the cracks were already spreading. I pulled into the parking lot of the Grand Des Moines Ballroom. There were valets, red carpets, and local news crews. I saw the banners, celebrating 25 years of Dalton Construction. I saw Julian on the steps, surrounded by the Vanguard investors. He looked radiant. He looked like the king of the world. He saw my truck, and his smile faltered for a heartbeat. He hurried down the steps to meet me. "You're late, Dad," Julian hissed, grabbing my arm. "The press is waiting. Where's the suit? Why are you still in that vest?" I looked at my son, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel grief. I felt the cold, hard peace of a builder who has finally cleared the site. "I brought something better than a suit, Julian," I said, patting the folder in my hand. "I brought the truth, and I think the investors are going to find it very illuminating." "What are you talking about?" "The foundation, Julian," I whispered, leaning in until I could smell his expensive cologne. "The foundation is rotten, and I'm about to pull the pins." I walked past him, heading toward the stage. The music was playing, the cameras were flashing, and the city was watching. Julian thought he was having a retirement party. He had no idea he was attending his own funeral. The demolition was at T-minus 10 minutes, and I was the one holding the remote. The grand ballroom of the Hilton was a sea of black silk and polished diamonds. Crystal chandeliers hummed with an expensive electric energy, and the air was thick with the scent of lilies and the kind of high-stakes ambition that makes men forget where they came from. I stood at the edge of the stage, my heavy work boots leaving faint, dried mud tracks on the pristine white carpet. I was still wearing my high-visibility vest. I looked like a ghost from a construction site that had wandered into a royal court. Julian was already at the podium. He looked radiant under the spotlights, his hair perfectly gelled, his smile a masterpiece of corporate charm. He looked like the future. He looked like the man who was about to inherit a $300 million empire. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian's voice boomed through the speakers, smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. 25 years ago, my father started this company with a dream and a single truck. Today, we stand as the architects of this city's skyline. But time, as they say, waits for no man. It is my bittersweet honor to announce the retirement of a legend, Elias Dalton, a man who taught me that while we build with stone, we live for the future." The room erupted in applause. Julian gestured for me to come to the microphone. He leaned in as I approached, his hand gripping my shoulder with a strength that felt like a warning. "Take the mic, Dad," he whispered, his eyes cold as flint behind the smile. "Say your thank yous, sign the tablet on the pedestal, and we can go get you that nice room in Florida. Don't make this difficult. The paramedics are already in the lobby just in case you have an episode." I looked at the tablet sitting on the velvet-covered pedestal. It was the digital version of the papers I'd refused to sign in the office. One tap of my thumb, and 25 years of my life would be liquidated into Julian's Cayman accounts. Before I reveal the final, crushing blow I delivered to my son's house of cards, the moment the city realized that the Dalton legacy was built on a foundation of lies, please take a moment to subscribe to the Otis Archive. We are a community built on the stories of those who refuse to be erased, and your support is the concrete that allows these truths to be told. I value every story you share in the comments. Have you ever realized that your greatest enemy was someone you shared a last name with? I stepped up to the microphone. The room went silent. The local news cameras were rolling. The mayor was sitting in the front row, holding a plaque. I looked at the crowd. The architects, the investors, the men and women who had trusted my name for a quarter of a century. "My son is right about one thing," I began, my voice steady, the gravelly rasp replaced by the deep resonant tone of a man who had commanded 1,000-man crews. "Time waits for no man, and a foundation, once cracked, cannot be hidden by a coat of expensive paint." I saw Julian's smile falter. He stepped toward me, reaching for the mic. "Dad, I think the emotion is getting to you. Why don't we just—" I held up a hand, a gesture that had stopped massive cranes in their tracks for decades. Julian froze. "I didn't come here to retire," I said, looking directly into the lens of the main news camera. "I came here to perform a final inspection, because today I discovered that the Riverfront Tower, the building many of you have already bought units in, is a death trap." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. The Vanguard investors stood up, their faces turning a sickly shade of gray. "Elias, stop!" Sterling, the lead investor, shouted. "What are you talking about?" I pulled the digital drive from my pocket and plugged it into the podium's media link. "I'm talking about grade 40 steel being used where grade 60 was required. I'm talking about concrete pores that were never allowed to cure. And I'm talking about the systematic forgery of my signature on every safety certificate for the last 18 months. On the massive 85-inch screen behind me, the images began to scroll. High-definition photos of the crumbling core sample Silas and I had pulled 3 hours ago, scans of the physical weight bridge tickets showing the substandard material deliveries, and finally a side-by-side comparison of my real signature and the digital forgeries Julian had created. The room descended into a chaotic, vibrating silence. People were pulling out their phones. The investors were surrounding Julian. "It's a lie!" Julian screamed, his face turning a dark, ugly purple. "He's senile! Look at him! He's wearing a work vest to a black tie gala. He's had a breakdown." "I'm not the one having a breakdown, Julian," I said, stepping away from the podium. "But your building is. The city chief inspector is at the site right now. He's already issued a permanent condemnation order. Dalton Construction is under a federal safety audit as of 5 minutes ago." "You destroyed us!" Julian roared, lunging for me. "You just bankrupted $300 million. You're going to die in a public ward with nothing." I looked at my son, the boy I had once carried on my shoulders, and I felt a deep, hollow pity. "I'm not going to die in a ward, Julian," I said, my voice carrying over the noise of the crowd, "because of a little detail you missed in the archives. You see, you were so focused on stealing the company assets that you forgot about the ground they sit on." I pulled a single, yellowed piece of paper from my vest pocket. "This is the original land lease for Dalton Plaza, the building we're standing in. The corporation owns the glass and the steel, but I own the dirt. And under Section 14C of this lease, any criminal activity or gross violation of public safety by the tenant triggers an immediate termination." I looked at the Vanguard reps. "Gentlemen, as of this moment, Dalton Construction is being evicted from this building. The locks are being changed, the assets are being seized by the city for the Riverfront Victim Fund. And Julian, you're not the CEO of anything. You're just a man with a lot of forged documents and a very long prison sentence ahead of you." The double doors at the back of the ballroom opened. They weren't valets or caterers. They were federal agents from the Department of Justice and officers from the Major Crimes Division. I watched as they moved through the sea of tuxedos. I watched as the handcuffs clicked around Julian's wrists. The same wrists that were wearing the Rolex I had bought him with honest money. Julian didn't fight. He didn't scream. He just went limp, the weight of a lifetime of shortcuts finally pulling him down. As they led him past the stage, he looked at me. There was no apology in his eyes, only a flickering, desperate confusion, as if he still couldn't understand how a builder had outcalculated a titan. The ballroom cleared out in a matter of minutes. The lights were dimmed, the music was silenced, and the lilies began to smell like a funeral again. I sat on the edge of the stage, my boots dangling over the white carpet. Silas walked in a few minutes later, carrying 2 cold beers in brown bottles. He sat down beside me and handed me one. "Foundations are clear, Elias," Silas said, the sound of the bottle opening a sharp, satisfying pop. "The city is already coordinating the controlled demolition of the riverfront frame. Nobody's going to get hurt, except for my son," I whispered. "He did that to himself, Elias. You can't reinforce a heart that was born with a hairline fracture. You know that better than anyone." I took a long drink of the beer. It was cold, bitter, and tasted like the truth. The next 18 months were a storm that stripped the Dalton name down to the studs. The trial of Julian Dalton was the lead story in the Midwest for 6 months. The Tower of Lies case, the papers called it. Julian tried to plead insanity, claiming the pressure of the merger had broken him, but the evidence on the drive, The shell companies, the Macau gambling debts, the forged signatures, was an ironclad cage. He was sentenced to 20 years in a federal penitentiary for racketeering, grand larceny, and reckless endangerment. Dalton Construction was liquidated. Every crane, every truck, and every contract was sold to pay for the demolition of the riverfront tower and the restitution for the families who had invested their life savings into Julian's dream. I didn't try to save a cent of it. I let the lawyers and the auditors pick the bones clean. I moved out of the limestone mansion. I didn't need 20 floors of glass. I bought a small 2-bedroom ranch house on the outskirts of the city, the kind of house I used to build in 1999. One Saturday morning, about a year after the gala, I was out in the driveway working on my old truck. The sun was warm on my back, and the smell of oil and fresh-cut grass was in the air. A car pulled up the gravel drive. It was Sterling, the lead investor from Vanguard. He looked older, his expensive suit replaced by a casual sweater. He walked over and watched me work for a minute. "I heard you were back to swinging a hammer, Elias," Sterling said. "A hammer is an honest tool, Sterling," I said, wiping my hands on a rag. "It doesn't lie to you." "I'm starting a new firm," Sterling said, leaning against the fender. "A small one. Real infrastructure. No cloud-based models, no digital-first shortcuts. I want a partner who knows how to pour concrete that doesn't crumble. I want a man whose word is the load-bearing wall." I looked at the scars on my hands. I looked at the city skyline in the distance, the one I had built. "I'm retired, Sterling," I said, picking up a wrench. "But I have an apprentice, a man named Silas Thorne. He's looking for work, and he builds for the truth." Sterling nodded, a look of genuine respect in his eyes. "The truth? I suppose that's the only thing worth building on, isn't it?" "It's the only thing that stays up when the wind blows," I replied. I sat on my porch that evening watching the sun dip below the horizon. I didn't have a beach house in Florida. I didn't have a $300 million empire. I had a small house, a functioning truck, and a name that was once again associated with integrity rather than greed. I realized then that the most important build of my life wasn't a skyscraper or a hospital. It was the demolition of my own ego. I had spent 25 years building a future for a son who didn't want it, while ignoring the rot that was growing in the shadows of my own success. If you are listening to this, and you're working yourself to the bone for people who are already measuring you for a grave, if you feel the person you're building a ladder for is the one trying to kick it out from under you, remember this: you are the architect. You can always walk away from the tower. You can always clear the site. And as long as you have your tools and your truth, you can always build something better. Your dignity doesn't need 20 floors of glass to be seen. Justice isn't a payout from an account. It's the peace of knowing that your foundation is solid rock. Thank you for watching this story through to the end. It has been a long journey from that 20th floor to this porch, and I'm honored you walked it with me. If this story touched you, please share it in the comments. I truly value every voice in this community. Tell me, have you ever had to walk away from everything to find yourself? Your resilience is the heartbeat of the Otis Archive. Don't forget to subscribe and share this video with someone who might be building on sand today. Let them know that it's never too late to reset the line. Take care of each other, stay sharp, and remember, the most important thing you'll ever build is your own peace.